Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and mute all if I can find it. There it is. So, I am Kim with Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. And today we have Daniel Ehrlich. For anyone who was with us last time, you will, or have been on any of my tours to Israel, you will have met Danny, one of my favorite tour guides in all of Israel. And today he is going to walk us through the town of Capernaum. Go ahead, Danny.
Okay. Well, first of all, good evening, good morning, good day. We're from all over the world. Here in Israel, it's about 9:30 at night on Wednesday evening. And I so appreciate the miracle of Zoom where we can all communicate with each other. Of course, one of the frustrations is I see a lot of old friends, and there'll be, if we were all together in one place, we could chat and get together. But we'll take what we can get, and it's wonderful that we have the technology today to be able to connect in this way, which, this was like unthinkable. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, how would we have done this? So thank God for this. So listen, we're going to, as we deal with the issue of Kfar Nahum, it's part of the whole question. Well, we'll get into it. The issue is, for much of its history, the church has tried to downplay and even to deny its Jewish roots. I know this isn't news to any of you. Imagining Jesus and his disciples as part of the despised Jewish people was unthinkable for most Christians throughout history. And as you know, it remains so for many Christians even today. I can remember a few years ago, I was sitting in a kosher vegan restaurant in St. Louis, near Washington University. And I was sitting talking with one of the local students who was fascinated to hear that I was visiting from Israel. And he asked me, what are you doing here in St. Louis? So I told him I was teaching and speaking at synagogues and churches. He got a little bit of a confused look on his face, and he said, look, I understand why you're speaking at synagogues, but why are you speaking at churches? So I answered, I said, well, you do know that Jesus was Jewish, right? And he gave me a funny look, and he said, no. And then he said, really? And at that point, I suggested to him that he might want to start getting to church a little more often, that he's missing a little something in the education there. But there has been a change, I think, I can see it over the past century or so, especially in the last few decades. There are a lot of Christians who have come to understand that if they want to deepen their relationship with Jesus, if they want to know and understand Jesus and his teachings more deeply, then they need to get a better understanding of the Jewish society in which he and his disciples lived, and the Judaism which Jesus and his disciples practiced. Many Christians have come to appreciate that if they did not get to know Jesus, the Jewish preacher from the Galilee, then they will not be able to really get to know and connect to Jesus as their Messiah and Savior. And of course, Israel is the best place to encounter and explore the Jewish context of the ministry and message of Jesus. Bargel Pixner, the brilliant Benedictine monk, he was also a scholar and archaeologist, and he lived and worked in Israel from 1969 to 2002. He expressed it very well, I think. He said, the land of Israel is the fifth gospel. It explains much of what the Bible tells us. There's maybe nothing quite as exciting and as exhilarating for Jews and for Christians as exploring the land of Israel with Bible in hand, as we do on CFOIC trips to Israel. The Bible comes alive as we walk the land, and as we visit and explore the places where the dramatic and profound events of ancient Israel took place. Unfortunately, we're still living in the shadow of Corona, so visiting Israel in person is just not possible right now. So instead, we'll walk the land together virtually with our Bibles in hand. So today we're going to visit Kfar Nahum, or as it's sometimes known, Capernaum or Capernaum, and use the archaeological remains of the small Jewish fishing village in the Galilee to help us better understand the political, social, and religious realities of the Jewish Galilee 2,000 years ago, which of course forms the backdrop and context of the gospel accounts. So away we go. Now we're going to see if we can get the technology to work. I'm going to go to share screen and see if it works. Sometimes there are gremlins in it, but hopefully it'll work. Okay. Is it up? Can you see it? Kim, if you'll nod, yes or no, can you see the, you can see it. Great. Okay. All right. So we're going to try to start here and get slideshow going from the beginning. So we start. Kfar Nahum, the Jewish town where Jesus lived. Now, what does Kfar Nahum mean in Hebrew? It means the village of Nahum. Who is Nahum? We have no idea. But clearly, he was one of the people who founded the village, his family. And we'll see in the history, we kind of know when the village would have been founded, about 100 years before the ministry of Jesus, something of that sort. And here we have an aerial view of the synagogue in Kfar Nahum. So let's go along here. Now, why is Kfar Nahum or Capernaum important to us? Well, simply because in the Gospels, we're told that Jesus lives in Capernaum. And starting just with a little bit in Matthew 4, when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, in Kfar Nahum. And in Mark, a few days later, Jesus again entered Capernaum. The people heard that he had come home. He had come home. So Kfar Nahum becomes his home. And you can see in the pictures here, essentially an artist's rendition of what this little fishing village would have looked like. It's on the shores of the Sea of Galilee of the Kinneret. You can see the homes. You can see the port. You can see the fishing boats. You see the big, can you see my cursor, the arrow floating around? Do you see the arrow? You can see here the big building. This would have been the synagogue. If we think we know the location of it, and we'll take a look at what it might have looked like at various points. And here on the right, you can see an artist's reconstruction of some of the houses that would have been there. It's a small place, maybe 1,500 people. You know, it's not a metropolis, but going back 2,000 years ago, it's a fairly prosperous fishing village on the shores of the Sea of Galilee of the Kinneret. Now, as you know, the Gospels are not a history book. It's very hard to open the Gospels and say, okay, now I can, as many books of scripture in general, I'm going to open it now and get an exact, year by year accounting of Jesus's life and ministry. However, it gives us certain indications which help us to organize our thinking. And to some degree, this is a possible chronology. There are other ways you can do it. I'm basing this a little bit on Jim Fleming, who's done some great work in terms of, again, the connection of the land and the text. And basically, you can say, look, the initial stage, the first 30 years or so, all we get, the active ministry of Jesus is probably about 3 years, maybe a little less, from about 27 to 30 CE. First 30 years, not a public figure. We hear very little bit about what happens in his life at that point. There's a change, though. What the change seems to happen when the baptism of Jesus by John, his cousin, his colleague, depending on which text and traditions. And then we get a beginning of public teaching and preaching, at least part-time. But then something happens. John the Baptist is arrested by Herod Antipas, who's the tetrarch or the ruler of Galilee and Perea. And we'll get into these divisions in a minute. And then we get to the piece that we're looking at, and this I bolded. You can see on the screen, the full-time ministry. Jesus lives in Capernaum, in Kfar Nahum in the Galilee. He has full-time disciples. But a question arises. John the Baptist has just been arrested. He's arrested because he's preaching similar messages that Jesus is preaching. They're related, apparently. They're colleagues in some ways. How is Jesus able to preach and teach openly in Kfar Nahum for about a year, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, while his older colleague, cousin, John, is arrested? And that's really going to be the focus of our question, because through that question, we can get a little understanding what is happening in the world that they are inhabiting at that point, 2,000 years ago, the Jewish world here. Now, for about a year, Jesus will be living in Kfar Nahum, using it as his base for preaching in the Jewish communities of the Galilee. Then something else happens. There's the execution of John the Baptist by Herod Antipas, who is also looking to meet Jesus, if you recall from the gospel text. Jesus is now a wanted man. It's no longer safe for Jesus in Kfar Nahum. He's going to leave the area. We'll get into that story a little later. But take a look at the two maps here. First, the map on the left, which gives it to us sort of in a broad sort of sense. After Herod the Father, the Great, as he called himself, dies, the Roman Empire in about 4 BCE. I'm sorry, 4 BC, the Roman Empire decides they don't want a big Judean kingdom anymore, and they're going to divide Herod's Judean kingdom into 3 parts, to 3 of his surviving sons. And I say it that way because, as you know, Herod killed some of his sons because he thought they were plotting to get rid of him, which they probably were. He was not a very pleasant man, as you know. So we have 3 divisions after Herod dies. We have perhaps the most important, we have 3 divisions. One all the way up in the north, what is today Golan, parts of Syria, parts of Lebanon, is what's called the Tetrarchy of Herod Philip. That's where Caesarea Philippi will be. Philip, Caesarea Philippi. That's where Beit Saida is, in Herod Philip's territory. Then we have the Jewish, very Jewish areas in the green of the Galilee. Can you see that? And the Perea, the other side of the Jordan River, which today is the Kingdom of Jordan, very heavily Jewishly populated. And then, of course, the most important area is Yehuda and Shomron, Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland with Jerusalem in the middle of it. And that's going to go to Archelaus, Herod's son Archelaus. But Archelaus doesn't do well. And for all sorts of reasons, by 6 CE, only about 10 years after Herod dies, the Romans go to direct rule in Judea and Samaria. Samaria will be split off for the Samaritans, and the heartland of Judah, with Jerusalem as the center, is now going to be ruled by the Roman governors directly. Up in the Galilee and the Perea, and up in Golan with Herod Philip, you have a layer between the Romans and the Jews. That's the Herodian kings, the tetrarchs, Philip and Antipas, who the Gospels will call the fox up there. So you can see the difference. There are 3 different political realities. There's Herod Philip up in the Golan. There's Herod Antipas, the fox, ruling the Galilee and the Perea, and then Jerusalem and Judea under direct Roman rule. And you can see that perhaps a little clearer on the map on the right. You can see the Galilee and the Perea. You can see Samaria, which becomes separate. You can see Jerusalem, and you can see from 6 CE, Judea and Jerusalem are under direct Roman rule. What's called the Decapolis over here, this is a pagan area, and that'll be an area which, by and large, Jews won't go into, and doesn't really come much into our story today. Where is Kfar Nahum? You can see right up here on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. See where we are here? Quite a distance from Jerusalem. Now, how do we get to this point? And very, very quickly, we're not going to have there'll be no, I promise you, there'll be no history test at the end. But what happens? Look, the first temple is destroyed. Solomon's temple is destroyed in the 580s BCE by the Babylonians. But in 539 BCE, the Persians conquer Babylon. King Cyrus allows the Jews to return to Judah. The province of Yehud, you can see it over here on the left, is under the British Empire, under the Persian Empire until 332 BCE. You can see here the small little kingdom or commonwealth, if you will, of Yehud, Judah. And you can see how it compares to the old kingdom of Israel and the old kingdom of Judah, which was destroyed respectively by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So when they come back, it's very, very small. But in the 160s, the Jews rebel against the Greeks, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, and by 104 BCE, you can see the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim in Hebrew, that's their family name, the Maccabees, have restored most of the territory. Look at this map here of the Hasmonean or Maccabee kingdom. It's pretty much the same map as the old kingdom of Israel and the old kingdom of Judah. Takes them a while, but they do it. And you can see what happens when the Maccabee kings, who are the priests, the high priests who also become the kings, are ruling in Jerusalem. They're going to conquer the Galilee again, becomes Jewish, and the old Jewish towns will be reestablished. And we think that Kfar Nahum, you can see up here, right here on the Sea of Galilee, Kfar Nahum is probably reestablished after the Babylonian exile, but in about 100 BC, about 100 BCE is probably reestablished as Nazareth and all these other areas on the ruins of what had been the old Israelite towns in that area. So the Capernaum that we have at the time of Jesus would have been about 130 years old, something of that sort, give or take 100, 130 years old. So a few generations already living there in Capernaum, the Jewish fishing village on the shores of the Galilee. And just quickly to run through the history, we did some of this last time also. In 64, the Romans conquered Judea. 37-4, Herod is the king of Judah under Roman sponsorship. And you see he gets a fairly large kingdom. In 4 BCE, when he dies, Herod's kingdom is divided into 3 by the Romans among his sons. You can see it here clearly on the right. Remember we said Philip up here in Golanitis, Herod, the fox, if you will, in the Galilee, and the Perea in the purple, and then the main show, Judea and Samaria, Herod Archelaus. But remember, Archelaus is removed by the Romans already in 6 CE. So this comes under direct Roman rule, and this will be very important in the time of Jesus. He's not going to be dealing, when he's in Jerusalem anymore, with local leadership with any real power. In Jerusalem, it's going to be the Romans ruling. In the year 66, for all sorts of reasons, now we're in the CE period. The Jews revolt against Rome. In 70 CE, Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. By 73, Masada falls. That'll be the last gasp of independence. In the 130s, the Jews revolt against the Romans again. That's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And Jerusalem at that point will be transformed into a pagan city by the Romans, Aelia Capitolina, with pagan, gods everywhere. Jews will be banned from living in Jerusalem and Judea from the 130s. The Romans erase Judea from the map and replace it with the Greek geographic term Palestina. That's where we get it from. Remember, I said last time, it's a little bit as if the United States conquered Canada and wanting to erase Canadian nationalism began to call Canada North America. You take a geographic term and you replace the political term with it. So the Romans are trying to erase Jewish nationalism. And at that point in the 130s, Jewish life will shift up to the Galilee, down to the Negev area, and of course outside the land of Israel throughout the Roman Empire, etc. And from the 130s to 313, and this will come into the story of Capernaum, Christianity is illegal in the Roman Empire because it starts off as a kind of Judaism, which is legal, even if it's persecuted, but it's legal. But once it splits off from its Jewish roots and becomes something independent, it's considered an underground religion. It's considered a cult by the Romans. This is the period of underground religious and worship. No central Christian authority. You have like 30 different versions of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Until when? 313 CE, Constantine legalizes Christianity. By 324, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it standardizes what we know as Byzantine Christianity. And it's interesting, as any theologian will tell you, this marriage of this new religion, this new faith preaching love with the brutality of the Roman Empire from a theological perspective is a disaster. But as any marketer will tell you, from a marketing perspective, marrying the Roman Empire, it's a heck of a good deal. But there's a tension there, which will be felt, I think, throughout the centuries. How do you balance this temporal power and some of this brutality with the messages that are being preached? And of course, there's a moving away from Jewish roots here. Jews and Judaism will be persecuted both by the pagan Romans and then by the Christian Romans. And in the 630s, the Muslims conquer Israel, and we're not going to get into that part of the story today. Maybe we'll get a future session on that. And just to give you a sense of, why did that window pop up? To give you a sense of the Roman Empire in the first century, you can see it pretty clearly. You see in the red or the kind of purpley, that's the Roman Empire. And then you can see the client states, and you can see Judea here was a client state that's under Herod. Once they go to direct rule, really in the ministry of Jesus period, then that'll become not a client state anymore, but a a direct part of the Roman Empire. And you can see the land of Israel is on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. Who's to our further to the east? The Persians. And by the way, every time the Jews revolt against Rome, they're not stupid. Our ancestors weren't stupid enough to think that they were going to beat the Roman Empire. It's supposed to be coordinated with the Persians. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's amazing how the headlines of today are almost like the headlines of 2,000 years ago. You got the Persians playing at games here. We just celebrated the holiday of Purim and read the Megillah of Esther, the book of Esther, where the Persians are trying to destroy all the Jewish people. And then you look at the headlines today, and what is Iran, Persia saying almost every day? We want to destroy the Jewish people. It's remarkable how constant these things are. And here again, we can see, we saw this map earlier, it's a little bit bigger, but we're coming up here to Capernaum. You can see right here. But I want to already point out to you that if you look closely at this map, it's a little hard to see it, but if you put the two maps together, you see Capernaum here, it's in one jurisdiction in the Galilee. Bethsaida and Caesarea Philippi are in a different jurisdiction. They're in the area of Herod Philip. Keep that in the back of your head because it's going to become relevant to our story. Now, if you're a Jewish person living anywhere in the land here, you got three main layers of power and influence that you got to deal with. We complain about bureaucracy today. But it's the same kind of thing, except it's a little less sympathetic. At the very top, there's the Roman Empire. Right? We saw the huge Roman Empire. They're in charge. And locally, how will they be represented? By the army, by soldiers. And they're the ultimate authority and power. But in large parts of the empire, that's what they'll handle the military stuff. But they don't want to handle all the local stuff. It's messy, taxes, duties, borders, things like that. That they have the tetrarchs for. And this is where Herod's sons are going to come in, right? Archelaus, Herod Antipas, Philip. They're the Herodian rulers and the officials. They're the tax collectors. They're the middle ground. You got to be in good with them if you want to get anything done. And then, of course, the lowest level is going to be the local Jewish communal leadership, like the synagogue leadership, the town leadership, right? So we have these three layers: local Jewish community, the Herodian rulers, who are at least in name Jewish rulers under Roman sponsorship. And at the very top, always at the top of the pinnacle, is going to be the Roman Empire, represented by soldiers, by the army. So we come here to Capernaum, and you can see it's maintained by the Franciscans, by the way, who are really great scholars and archaeologists. A lot of people might not agree with them theologically, but they've done wherever they've done archaeological work, they've really done a great job. And you can see here, they put up a sign, Capernaum, the town of Jesus. And of course, relying on that statement, which says in there that Jesus had come home, right, in the Gospels to Capernaum. And here's a little bit of an aerial view. They've only excavated part of it, and we're going to be exploring this area here. We'll take a closer look, but you can see houses all around. And if you move to the left of the picture here, the town continues all around. So only a small piece of the town has been excavated, but you can see the sea down here, and the town would have been up here. And again, we get this great reconstruction of what it would have looked like. Now it's a little bigger. And again, they think about 1,500 people living here about 2,000 years ago. Now, for those who have been, you're familiar with Capernaum. For those who haven't been, let's transport to Israel for a few minutes, just to get a sense of the sights and sounds of Capernaum today. Oh, whoops. I'm sorry. That stopped. Why is this stopped? See, I told you there's gremlins in the... Hold on. Let's come out of the slideshow again. I'm sorry. And let's start from the current slide. looking at the synagogue. They have an aerial view. You see the Sea of Galilee, Kinneret. Okay, and by the way, you can see the fence over here. You can see the fence here. The far side of the fence, that belongs to the Greek Orthodox Church. There's the right side here where we're looking at, that was bought by the Catholic Church, by the Franciscans. And again, they bought it in the late 19th century, and they really did great archaeologists. The Greek Orthodox are not as into archaeology at all. But they built a beautiful church on their part of the property. But it means that more of the town is under here that hasn't been excavated. And of course, all around here, also more of the town that hasn't been excavated. Let's continue on. Okay, so we're going to be, do you see that window that says, please move this window away? Is that showing up on everyone's screen? I don't know why it's there. I figured out a way to get rid of it, and now it's come back. So we're going to be looking at three main places. We're going to be looking at the synagogue. You can see here, here's how it looks close up, but you see where it is in the picture. We're going to be looking at the house next door to the synagogue. Is it the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader? And we're going to be looking at one of the houses that became a church. So we're going to be looking at these three properties and see if we can get the story to help us answer our question. How is it that Jesus was able to survive for at least a year in Capernaum when, John the Baptist has already been arrested? He's, preaching similar messages. How can it be that he can operate openly, and the Gospels tell us that he uses Capernaum as his base for preaching throughout the Galilee? John's been arrested, and Jesus still continuing. Well, remember, we have three power bases who could give Jesus protection and a home and protect him from the powers that be. Let's see if the Gospel texts give us information. That's not their point, of course. But as they describe what's happening, they do give us this information. So let's see. Jesus lives in Capernaum. One of the first things we hear is that he heals Simon's mother-in-law. Simon, Peter, I always say he wasn't called Simon, he wasn't called Peter. His Hebrew name was Shimon, and his name that he would pass in the Roman Empire would have been Petrus. And they're apparently prominent members of the local Jewish community based on where we think their house was. And look at Matthew 4. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum. Luke, once he's there, Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her, rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once, and as a good Jewish mother, what does she start doing? She begins to bring them food, of course, and she begins to wait on them. Now, this is our first clue. He's been taken in by a local Jewish family, apparently a prominent Jewish family, who's the matriarch is sick. Jesus heals her. So we know that he already has one family that's very much in his corner who will protect him if they can. Let's continue on, though, and see, because we still have to find more of that. Now, there's a church at Capernaum. We talked about Peter today. There's a church in Capernaum we talked about Peter's mother-in-law's house, right? Where Simon's mother-in-law's house, where Jesus apparently lived. Now, we can see, take a look here on the left, and you can see the picture on the right. The church at Capernaum was built atop of what had been a house in a residential area of Jewish Capernaum, built in the 1st century BCE. Maybe this is the house of Simon, Peter's mother-in-law. Why do we think that? They didn't leave a sign there that said, Jesus slept here kind of thing. What brings us to do this? Well, we can see how people closer to the time of the ministry of Jesus related to the structure. By the late 1st century CE, in other words, within a few decades of the crucifixion of Jesus, from the archaeology, it seems that part of the house was no longer used as a residence, but became some sort of community gathering place. But by 300 years later, by the 4th century, we can tell that the gathering place has become expanded and renovated. Now, what's happening in the 4th century? Christianity is becoming legal. Remember, it was illegal to the 300s, right? And then Constantine makes it legal. And then in the 5th century, the 400s, we get an 8-sided Byzantine church. Can you see on the picture on the right? You see it's an octagon. It's not a regular shape. It's 8-sided. And we know in the Byzantine period, 8-sided means something happened here. It's not a regular parish church. It means something happened here. Whenever you see 8-sided, that tells you it's a church that's commemorating something. And by the way, if you've been on the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim shrine is 8-sided. Well, it's built by the same Byzantine architects hundreds of years later. And in the Muslim tradition, something happened there. But that tells us that Christian or followers of Jesus from the 1st century all the way to the 5th century, when we can see the church believed and came here underground for centuries, something happened here. We're in Capernaum. What do we have in the sources? A place where Jesus would have healed and lived. So the working assumption is that they turned the house of Peter, Simon's mother-in-law, into this building that became a church. So again, we're seeing here relationship to the local Jewish community. A prominent member has been healed by Jesus, but that's not all that happens with the Jewish community. And here you can see how the archaeologists have reconstructed the different periods. And now the Catholics, the Franciscans, built a modern Catholic church on top of this historic house church. You can't see it the way we saw it from above anymore. But I must say, to their credit, they built a glass floor in the middle of the church inside. You can see it sort of hovers over it like a spaceship, and it looks down into that 8-sided structure that we just saw. Now, here's an overview again. This is the house church where we think was the house of Simon Peter, and where Jesus would have lived. And here's a great view. You see the Sea of Galilee, you see Tiberias over here on the far side, and you see this mountain pass here. This would have been the mountain pass from Nazareth. Remember, Jesus comes from Nazareth to Capernaum. How? From the mountains of the Galilee down to the basin of the Kinneret. Now, we have the church. We have the house, we think of Simon Peter, which centuries later becomes a church. We have the synagogue over here. And then in the middle, we have a house. Here's another house. We have here the house of Simon Peter's family. And over here, we have another house. Now, what archaeologists ask, who might have lived in the house next door to the synagogue? Maybe a synagogue leader. Do we know of a synagogue leader in Capernaum? Well, yes, we do. Because we come to in the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and Mark and Luke especially. Look, Mark 5. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus, or in Hebrew, Yair, and he saw Jesus. He fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him. My daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her. She will be healed. So Jesus went with him. And again in Luke. So now we already had Peter's mother who had been healed by Jesus. Now we get one of the leaders of the synagogue whose daughter has been healed by Jesus. And Jesus is a visiting rabbi, teacher, preacher, but they're going to be in his corner. Anything that they can do for him, and they just saved their lives. So now we know that we can see very clearly that there are people who, in the leadership of the Jewish community, who are going to be very much in Jesus's corner. If they can protect him, they will. Let's see, we still have 2 more layers to find. We have to find the Herodians and we have to find the Romans. But if we're talking about the synagogue, and maybe that the house next door to the synagogue is the house of Yair, or another one of the synagogue leaders, and you can see here remnants. Here the remnants of the synagogue, and here remnants of the house next door to the synagogue. Good chance of it being Yair or Jairus' house. You know, we have a lot of mention of Jesus spending time in the synagogue, and of course he's a Jew of the Second Temple period. Of course he does. And here I just brought some of the gospel verses, and it was interesting looking. When I went online looking at the art depicting it. You know, you look at older art; it's very Christian. A Jew looking at this would say, oh, I have nothing to do with this picture. But look at the more modern stuff, right? We talked about a little bit of a change of understanding of, if you want to connect to Jesus, you have to connect to Jesus as a Jew. And here, look at the more modern stuff, Jewish person, oh, they're in synagogue, they're in shul. Whereas here, they say, I don't know where the heck they are, on the left here. So you can actually see in the ark, you can see some of this change that's taking place. So synagogue, going to the synagogue, we'll have it over. He'll be there on Shabbat. He'll read the from the prophets. After he's in synagogue, he goes to heal. Synagogue is an important part of Jesus' life, as it was for all Jews at that time, and synagogue life, of course, today, very important for Jewish communities. And we get this great reconstruction. Here you can see the ruins as they exist today, the main hall over here with the pillars and the side room, which would have been the room as synagogues still have today. And this is the model for study and for communal meals, maybe for travelers to be able to sleep in. And here you can see a good view of the main hall. And here's some artist renditions of what they think it would have looked like. 2 stories, you can see the entranceway, etc. So it gives us an idea. And here's some of the carvings that they found from the synagogue, some fascinating stuff. And one thing is, so you can see the menorah here, right? That's very clear, right? Depicting Jerusalem. You can see the menorah. And you can see these various carvings here. And, and often we'll say, well, gee, what's the Jewish symbol here? People will, of course, point to the Star of David, right? The Jewish star. But it's not. 2,000 years ago, the Star of David is not a particularly Jewish symbol. Lots of peoples use it. Yeah, 5-sided stars, 6-sided stars. The Jewish symbols were these. The pomegranates, the grapes, the olives, the produce of the land of Israel. You'll see the date palm trees will be on the Jewish coins of the Jewish revolts, and the menorah. Star of David, no, but it's used here as well. One of the fascinating things they find is this stone, which you can see it has wheels and pillars, and they think either it's a description. It could be one of 3 things we think. Either it's a depiction of the temple in Jerusalem, but then the question is, why does it have wheels? So some people think maybe it's the Ark of the Covenant, remember, in the desert, and then before it gets placed in Jerusalem, it would move. And the third one, which might be a very good possibility, is that at this time, 2,000 years ago, even later than that, there's no set ark in the synagogue like you have today where the Torah scrolls are kept. It's wheeled in and out. Maybe from the house next door where it's kept for the services, and maybe that's what's being depicted, but we don't know. But it's an amazing carving in any event, and you can see the inscriptions, just like in synagogues and churches today. What does the inscription say? This was dedicated by. And the one here on the left is in Aramaic, the one here on the right in Greek, and these were the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek would be the languages used in the Jewish community in the late Second Temple period, 2,000 years ago. Now, we're talking about the synagogue. The synagogue, we know, obviously gives us the power structure of the Jewish community, right? The leader of the synagogue, right? He's in good with them. They respect him. They're giving him honor. They're going to protect him. But unexpectedly, the synagogue connection also is going to give Jesus a connection to the Roman Empire. Remember, the highest level of authority here is the Roman army. And what are we told in Matthew? When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion, a Roman soldier, came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly. And long story short, Jesus heals the servant of the Roman soldier. And we have it also in Luke. Now, in Luke, we're told that, because the question comes up, should he be helping this Roman soldier? They're not exactly very popular in Jewish society. And they say a remarkable thing. Look in Luke, what I put in red here. This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation, the Jewish people, and he has built our synagogue. A Roman centurion, he gave the money to build a synagogue? What does that mean? Now, folks, we have to know there's a background here. Paganism is running its course by the early 1st century CE. People are no longer believing. And there's only one other religious system in the Roman Empire than paganism, and that's Judaism, the Torah, monotheism. This is before Christianity. There's only one monotheistic faith, and that's Judaism. And we know from the sources that thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of women, pagan women, will convert to Judaism, but men are going to hold off. Why are men going to hold off? not going to go into it in detail, but for obvious reason, circumcision. That's a biggie as an adult to do. So what we have instead is what our sources call Yirei Adonai, the God-fearers, pagans who come to synagogue every Shabbat. They listen to the sermons, the teachings of the rabbis. They're learning Bible. They're learning the traditions. They're connecting to the God of Israel, but they're not becoming Jews, because that final step is very hard. And they're going to be throughout the Roman Empire, in the land of Israel, up in Syria and Turkey, etc. And that's, by the way, decades later, Paul will find them in the synagogues. Where does he find we call the Gentile churches? Where does he find Gentiles? He's going to speaking in the synagogues. They're in the synagogues. And of course, what will he say to them? What's he say? Circumcise your hearts. And this will give them their entry to connect to the God of Israel. But that hasn't happened yet at this point. And we have a centurion in Capernaum, who is apparently a God-fearer, Yirei Adonai, and he built a shul. He built a synagogue. And Jesus heals his servants. So we've already established the connection to the Jewish community. Leader of the synagogue, prominent family, heals them. They are solidly backing Jesus. Certainly, whether they're his followers or not isn't the question. They're going to protect him and make sure he has the right to keep teaching and speaking because they think he's great. And now we have the highest authority in the land. The local Roman soldier, the local Roman military is a God-fearer, and the visiting rabbi, Jesus, has healed his servants. So we've got 2 out of the 3 power sources right here in Capernaum, which are working to protect Jesus, helping us understand how is Jesus able to function while John the Baptist has already been arrested. But we're still missing a middle layer, right? That's the Herodians. The Roman Empire is up on top, but all the dirty work, if you will, is done by the local rulers, the Herodians, Herod's sons, and their administration. Can we find them? And my answer is, of course we can find them. They're there in the text waiting for us to find them. We'll get back maybe later to this question, when was the synagogue built? It's not central to our story right now. The Herodians. Remember, I'm not going to go into the whole family here, but you can see the family line and the 3 different kingdoms. Now, remember, they're in charge of taxes. They're the ones who have to collect the taxes and then send it on to Rome. Nobody likes tax collectors, not then and not today, perhaps. They're not popular people. Not only are they stealing the people blind, they're working for the Herodians or working for the Romans. They're considered traitors by the people. So can we find any Herodian officials in the story in Capernaum in the text? And lo and behold, there it is in the text. Let's go to John. Once more, he visited Cana in the Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. And again, Jesus is going to heal the royal official's son. And we say royal officially. That's not Rome. That's the Herodians. And then we get. In Mark, we get. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. He's a tax collector. He's also Herodian. He's a Herodian official. No one's talking to him. No one's inviting him home for a meal. And what does he say? Follow me, Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. And of course, he'll be criticized for that. But here we have 2 Herodian officials who are one who he saved the life of his son. The other one who was a pariah, and he's been welcomed not just by any old person, by a visiting rabbi preacher who people in the town really respect and like, has invited him to join him. Folks, that's big stuff. Imagine being so alone and nobody wants you. And then, not only are you taken in, but you're taken in by an important person. So we have found our 3 layers. It's right there in the text. Now, the text wasn't written to tell us that. The text is there to teach that, but we trying to look for the political and social reality of Jesus's life and times, we find it. It's there. So these 3 layers are protecting Jesus. But what happens? Well, something happens. Let's take a quick look. How is Jesus able to preach, operate open Capernaum for about a year? Well, his older colleague and cousin John is being arrested and then executed, because that's exactly what's going to happen next. And the three main layers, remember, is the Roman Empire, the Herodian rulers, the local Jewish leaders. They are able to protect Jesus until the stakes get too high. That's when John the Baptist was arrested, and then they no longer have the power to run interference and protect him. What's the big game changer? The execution of John the Baptist. Because he was arrested. They could still, but once he's beheaded, he's executed, and then they get, who tells Jesus? Apparently, these are his friends and protectors, tell him that, well, that Herod Antipas, remember the ruler of the Galilee, where he is up here, is looking to meet Jesus, and he's not looking to meet him to invite him to dinner. And at that point, apparently, it's no longer safe for Jesus in Capernaum in the Galilee. Jesus and his disciples cross the border. Now, the problem is when if you read the text without knowing the political realities, well, they went, he leaves Capernaum, he ends up in Bethsaida, he's ended up in Caesarea Philippi. It's all the same, right? It isn't the same. It's in a different political, up here, this is Golan, this is under Herod Philip, where Jesus is not a wanted man like he is here in the Galilee. And apparently there is no a warrant for his arrest up here in the area of Caesarea and Bethsaida, which is in a different jurisdiction. They cross the border, they head to Bethsaida and Caesarea in Golanitis, which is the tetrarchy of Herod Philip, where there's apparently no warrant for his arrest. And this is where the transfiguration is going to happen, probably at the foot of Caesarea Philippi. And from there, Jesus is going to head to Jerusalem, which is under direct Roman rule for the final confrontation. He's not really going back to the Galilee, where he's a wanted man. There's nothing more for him to do there. He will not be able to continue functioning there. So, through the Gospels, we've gotten a really good look at the realities of the Jewish community. Then, if you want to function, if you want to be able to influence people and get out and teach and read, you have to work with local power authorities, and you have to work with them honestly. Not like some rotten, dirty politician, but honestly and openly. And clearly, that's what happens with Jesus in Capernaum. First, with the local Jewish community, the mother-in-law of Peter, Simon, and the Yair is the leader of the synagogue. Then with the Roman centurion representing the highest authority, who's one of those God-fearers, who's feeling connected to the God of Israel and to the Bible. And thirdly, the Herodian officials, who are the tax collector and the royal official, who will protect them as long as they can, but at some point it becomes impossible to do so. And as they say, the rest is history. One more piece just to close out here. One of the other reasons Capernaum becomes so important, and this is more for Catholics, the Catholic Church sees the Pope as the heir of Peter, Simon. So Capernaum, as the home of Peter, Simon's wife's family, is very significant. Capernaum is also on the northern shore of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, where Matthew relates Jesus saying to Simon Peter, "And I tell you that you are Petros, the rock, and at this rock, Petra, I will build my church." For the Catholic Church, this primacy of Peter has been a bedrock of their claims of being the legitimate and authentic church. And obviously, as we know, other Christian groups do not exactly accept this interpretation, but this is part of the reasons why the Franciscans are there. And again, as we might disagree with them theologically and all sorts of other ways, thank God they're there, because they were certainly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the best archaeologists around. And if they had not bought up this area, we wouldn't have had it at all. So that's Capernaum a little bit. I hope that you enjoyed getting a sense of it. And if people have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Or if people have comments, I don't know if people have written in any, or if you want to share them, Kim, I'd be happy to.
Sure. Some people came in late and we had some questions about the Capernaum. So can you say that in Hebrew and exactly what that means?
So Capernaum literally means village or town of comfort. Nahum, nachamu ami yomar lochem. Comfort ye my people. So it's a name. It's a very popular name. Nahum. It's a good name, comforter. So it's the village of Nahum. From what we can tell from the archaeology, it would have been reestablished after the Babylonian exile, about 100 years or so before the ministry of Jesus, maybe 130 years or so, when the Maccabees reconquered that area. So you'll have maybe 3 or 4 generations already, maybe a little more, having lived there already in this new Second Temple period as well. So that's Kfar Nahum in Hebrew. And you see the Franciscans try to keep it so it doesn't look like Capernaum. They write it out Kfar Nahum, keeping to the original a little better than others do, I think.
Any idea why the government has not yet excavated such an important historical site as Capernaum?
Well, because it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the Franciscans and the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek Orthodox Church is not interested in any archaeology, and the Franciscans have done some really good archaeology, but only in limited areas. Look, almost every hill in Israel and valley, there's archaeology to do. And it's one of the things I love about Israel. There's always new old things to see, but it becomes a budgetary issue. How much are you going to spend on archaeology, and how much are you going to spend on health, education, defense, things of that sort. So it's a balance, and Israel, the state of Israel, work in partnership with universities, with churches, all sorts of things of that sort, to fund these things and to work on these things. So the relationship and the partnership with the Franciscans here has been excellent. They themselves are scholarly, I'd say, in their approach. So their part has been mostly excavated, but the Greek Orthodox Church throughout the land has been very resistant to any archaeological work on their property. Here, that's the same issue. We have the pool of Siloam in the city of David, where we have the beginning of the steps, but we can't go further because it's on the property of the Greek Orthodox Church. So it's not so much a question of asking them or not asking them. Their position is pretty clear. So again, it's been partially excavated. We've learned a heck of a lot, but there's always more to learn, no question. I see a question that came up. I don't know about the dating of the synagogue, if we want to deal with that question.
Yeah, go for it. Well, yeah, there's a couple more. We've got one. You say that Jews were banned from Jerusalem and Judea. I thought that this concerned only Jerusalem, and that finally some Jews still remained in the country. Not all were expelled or sold as slaves.
Right. Now, when I say expelled from Jerusalem and Judea, it means the area today south of Jerusalem, essentially. Yeah. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and moving down in that direction. Jewish life will stay in the land of Israel. It'll move south of Bethlehem to Susia, for example, where we have a CFOIC video on the CFOIC site about Susia, and northwards into the Galilee, places like Kfar Nahum, and into the Golan Heights area. So Jewish life will continue in the land, but not in Jerusalem and Bethlehem areas. Bethlehem, assuming from the Roman perspective, because it's the birthplace of the Davidic line, and Jerusalem because it was the capital. But Jews will, of course, smuggle themselves into Jerusalem regularly on pilgrimage, but they won't be allowed to live in Jerusalem from essentially the 130s, the Bar Kokhba revolt, through the 300s when the empire becomes Christian, Byzantine, and all the way till the 600s when the Muslims conquer. And ironically, the Muslims will be liberators. They'll let Jews back in to live in Jerusalem, and they're going to be liberators for some Christians also, because you still had non-Byzantine Christians. Remember, before Constantine in 300 says, this is what it means to be a Christian, there were all sorts of Christian groups. Most of them have to go underground from the 300s. Most of them are killed, are executed as heretics, right? We know the stories. But some managed to survive. And ironically, when the Muslims come in the 600s, non-Byzantine Christians can sort of come out of the closet also. And that's a whole story in and of itself.
So, yeah, go for it on the question on the synagogue.
So when the archaeologists found the synagogue, you can imagine the excitement, right? My God, we have found the synagogue where Jesus preached, on Shabbat. Where he was, it's wow, it's amazing. And they looked at it, and you can see it's a grand synagogue. It's built out of limestone. You can see in the picture. in an area where the natural stone is the black basalt stone. So so the stones are imported. I mean, it's a great structure. It's also built in what early archaeologists thought was the style of first century synagogues. We've learned, by the way, that just like today, people use archaeological styles from all sorts of different periods. They did the same thing 2,000 years ago. Because what happened as they did this great archaeological work, they find under some of the pillars coins from, well, the 400s. Now, you can't have a synagogue built in the first century with coins underneath from the 400s. So they realized that the synagogue they're seeing there is built in the Byzantine period. Right, the Byzantines are already in the 300s and on, is built in the Byzantine period. And what's amazing is the Byzantines will persecute the Jews terribly, forbidding the building of new synagogues is one of the things that they will find. And yet we find here in Capernaum and lots of other places synagogues built in the Byzantine period. So the question is, well, now there's a loophole in the Byzantine laws. You can't build a new synagogue, but what can you do? You can renovate an existing synagogue. And again, this would be the loophole that'll be used throughout the area for Jews to be able to build synagogues, even though the Christian Byzantine Empire says you can't. So the archaeologists say, all right, let's see what's under. Now, if you look under, and I don't want to redo the share screen, but there's under this beautiful limestone synagogue, there's a black layer of basalt stone. And initially they thought, okay, that's the foundation. So they look more closely, it doesn't exactly follow the same line. So, there's a great principle in history. Holy builds on holy. It doesn't have to be your holy, right? Holy builds on holy. So where are you going to build a new synagogue? Where the old synagogue was, and especially given the Byzantine laws, that makes it an absolute must that you have to do it that way. So today, most scholars believe that the synagogue that we have today, which is clearly from the 400s or so, is built right on top of the synagogue of the time of Jesus, and we can see the black basalt layer underneath it that was probably from that actual structure. There are some who have the idea that, well, no, it doesn't make sense. How could they have built a synagogue in the Byzantine period, especially with a church almost next door? Right? Remember, the eight-sided church is the same period. Maybe it was a tourist synagogue for Christian pilgrims coming. I don't think there's much. I mean, there's some scholars who go with that. I don't think there's much to recommend that theory. One, because the inscriptions show us clearly a Jewish place here, a place of worship, and the carvings show us a Jewish place of worship. And the Byzantines were not shy. They would have put Christian symbols all over the synagogue. We today would say, "Well, that's not historically accurate." But they weren't concerned about that. They would have done that. So, and we know that Capernaum will have a Jewish community up till the Muslim conquest in the 600s and 700s. So there's really no reason to assume that it wasn't. And here's a great thing. This is the Byzantine Empire, 300s, 400s, 500s, 600, a time when Jews are being persecuted by this Christian Roman Empire. And somehow in Capernaum and some other places, apparently Jews and Christians are coexisting. There's a synagogue and a church almost next door to each other. It's pretty remarkable. Too rare, but pretty remarkable. So there's a seed of hope there, for all sorts of things that maybe once were and could be again.
Let's see. Couple more questions. Is the synagogue of Chorazin the same as Capernaum or Capernaum? I think Chorazin is up by Bethsaida.
Chorazin is not far from there. It's not as well preserved. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up to see. I'm not sure how that one is dated, because it's bits and pieces. It's not the same. Where you can see a clear first century synagogue is in Gamla. In Gamla up in the Golan Heights, that's a clear first century synagogue. And there's this and the one in Magdala in Migdal now that's been sort of turned into a great visitor center. Also, you can see a pretty good first century synagogue, but Chorazin I'm not sure about.
Okay. Kathy and Lawrence, if you're still on, you might need to clarify this. We heard about a new pathway around this area. Is it now open? So I'm assuming this is around Capernaum.
Yes.
Well, it's like part of what they call the Jesus Trail, which you can actually walk from Nazareth, and all the way down to past Migdal and to Capernaum and down and around the Sea of Galilee. Yeah, the path has been open. It's right now. It's like before because of COVID. Capernaum is closed. Remember, it's run by it's in partnership with the National Parks Authority, but it's run by the Catholic Church, by the Franciscans. And I guess this doesn't pay for them economically at this point to open it. So it's been closed for months and months at this point. Now, there is a little monastery on the ground. So I guess, they're getting a chance to be monastic a little bit without the thousands of visitors that come usually. So, everything has its silver lining, I suppose.
Well, maybe they're doing some more excavations or something. But I think that's all the questions. If anybody has anything, feel free to unmute and ask.
Okay, I just want to ask, how long is that path in distance?
You know what? I'll look it up and I can send it to Kim or I should get it to you. I'll write it down. The Jesus path.
Danny, I've got a question, if that's okay.
Sure. Sure.
What's the relationship between the Maccabee family and the name Hasmoni again? I haven't quite got the connection between those two names.
In Hebrew, Hashmonai is apparently the family name of the Maccabees. We have Matityahu, Matthew, Mattathias, the father, and then the sons Yehuda, Simon. By the way, they're like the 160s, 150s. Look, 150 years later, the time of the ministry of Jesus. Look at the names that we have recorded in the Gospels. What names are Jews giving to their children? And looking back 150 years to the Maccabees, Simon, Judah, Matthew, right? They're looking back to a period of independence as something, to look back to with nostalgia. You can see it from the names. So when we talk about the Maccabees, we're sort of talking about Mattathias and his sons, Judah, Simon, Jonathan, who lead the revolt between the 160s and the 140s. Once they finish the wars with the Syrian Greeks and they negotiate a settlement, we get a semi-independence. By the 130s, the 120s, we then get the Maccabees take on kingship, even though they're priests. They're not supposed to be the kings, and they're severely criticized by rabbinic literature for doing so. They become known as the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim. So usually we speak about the Maccabees, we're talking about those who lead the revolts from 160s to 140s, 130s, and then from the 120s and on till the 60s when the Romans conquer is the Hasmonean kingdom. Now remember, Herod marries a Hasmonean princess because Herod is neither a son of David, so he doesn't have that legitimacy to be the king. He's not a Hasmonean, he's not a priest, he doesn't have that legitimacy to be the king, so he does the next best thing. He marries a Hasmonean princess, Miriam, and remember his grandson, from the line of Miriam, if I'm not mistaken, Agrippa will become the king briefly in the 40s. And almost succeeds in sort of straighten things out with the Romans, but as we know, it doesn't work. And by 70, the city of Jerusalem is destroyed.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hold on just a second. So Vi brought up a good point before everybody starts taking off. We will be doing another presentation with Danny, or Danny will be doing another presentation next month. So I'll be sending out links to that if you guys want to sign up for it. But we are going to be approaching the subject of the Holocaust. It'll be right before Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel. And so we're going to kind of take a little tour through Poland a little bit. So just let you know that that's coming up. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, I was there in Capernaum in 2015, and I was wondering if it's changed much, if they've done any more excavating around there, or because I'd like to go back.
Nothing that I'm aware of. It's pretty much as it was.
Okay. And also, it's too bad they didn't put Maccabees in the Bible, because it's such a important story for the Jews.
Yeah, it's interesting. The final canonization of the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, it occurs about the same centuries that the early church fathers are trying to decide, what goes into the Christian scriptures.
Right.
And this is the 200, 300, and 400 CE. And by this point, the Maccabees are not in favor, I'd say, within our leadership. Because why? What the rabbinic leadership by the 200, 300, 400 is trying to do is convince the Jewish people, stop revolting against the Roman Empire. We're knocking our heads against it. We keep losing, and it's disastrous. And they'll go to great lengths, and they're also unhappy with the Maccabees, because what happens? The Maccabees is a revolt against the Hellenization, the paganization, Hellenization of Jerusalem, the Jewish people. The descendants of the Maccabees, who become these Hasmonean kings, become very much Greek-style rulers. So a few hundred years later, looking back at the Maccabees, we have the holiday of Hanukkah. We'll sell, and that's why, if you look, what's the story that will be told primarily? A very strange story that has very little basis in any of the sources written down in the Book of Maccabees, about a small cruse of oil, which is not the main story of Hanukkah at all. Look at the Book of Maccabees. It's about a military victory and reestablishing the temple service and all this. Why? Because the rabbis, they're not going to erase the military, but the heroes of the Maccabees, but they want to downplay it. Don't think military, think God's salvation. And it's clearly a piece of that. So the Book of Maccabees, they say, no, we're not putting it in. So it doesn't get into the final canon, even though many Jews these are Jewish books, and many Jews were reading it, but they decided not to put it into the final canon.
Okay, thank you.
And just one thing, on canon, it didn't matter for centuries, because for centuries, you had scrolls, right? You had scrolls. So you could have 10 scrolls. I mean, only rich people have the scrolls. That's another thing we have to remember. Today, we open the Bible. Oh, I want to look something up. Look, 2,000 years ago, where were you going to go look it up? You didn't have a Bible, right? If you were lucky, you had 1 or 2 scrolls, or maybe 1 or 2 books of the Bible in your house. Maybe if you were rich, maybe in the synagogue they had others. There was no yet. I mean, it wasn't 100% set. It was 80% set, let's say 2,000 years ago. When does it become an issue what's in? When we move from scrolls to books, right? Because then you got to decide what goes in between. And that's when you get committees that say, okay, this goes in, this doesn't go out. Now, what goes in is all very good. It doesn't mean that some of the stuff that didn't get in wasn't also very good, but for all sorts of reasons, doesn't make the final cut. Doesn't mean they're not valuable books to read and to learn from. Although, again, over the centuries, different authorities, both church authorities and Jewish authorities, say, don't read that stuff that wasn't included. But we've been, I think, smarter over the centuries. We read it anyway, and we learn lots of things from it.
Danny, I want to ask, where do you live?
Oh, so I live in Efrat, just outside of Jerusalem, just outside of Bethlehem. Of course, one of the biblical names for Bethlehem. And Efrat is, of course, one of the communities that CFOIC has been involved with for years in supporting all sorts of children's projects and community projects. We're today a town of about 12,000 people and growing. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to live. We're about, depending on traffic, about 15 to 20 minutes from Jerusalem, just
Is
south
that
of
where
Jerusalem.
Sandra's son lives, Efrat?
Yes.
Yes, Sandra's
Yes, it
son
is.
lives in Efrat.
Okay,
Yeah.
I've been there twice, and I've been to his house. It's really a wonderful place. Beautiful, modern.
Yes, it is. It's a lovely, lovely town.
Annie, I'd like to ask a question, if I may. First of all, thank you very much for a really interesting talk, extremely interesting. You mentioned Gamla. Am I right in thinking that Gamla was a hotspot of zealots? And was another reason why Jesus may have left Capernaum was because there was an attempt, you could say possibly by the zealots, that he could be a potential leader to lead the Jews against the Romans. And Jesus wasn't going to have anything to do with that. He immediately told his disciples to get in the boat and go over to the other side. And he went up into a mountain to pray. He wanted to get away from being part of a political uprising. Is that a possibility that there was a threat to his ministry from zealots up in Gamla? And the other thing I wondered about when I saw that sculpture of what looked like the temple on wheels. Am I right in thinking this is a time when the temple doesn't exist, but they still wanted to worship God? So was it symbolic that the temple had moved away from Jerusalem to the local synagogue, and that the synagogue was where the worship was going on when they couldn't worship in the temple anymore?
Yeah, well, I think, look, in terms of your first issue, look, as he moves across the sea into Golanitis, right, crossing the border, he's actually moving closer to Gamla, because Gamla's up there. We don't have information about it. I mean, it could be, the text is, I think, is pretty silent about that. There's been some speculation, was Jesus, some people say Jesus was a zealot. Some people say, so he's an anti-zealot. I don't think the text gives us either direction there. So I would be, I'd be very careful on that, because, I think we have to go with the text and what it tells us and what we can see around it. But certainly moving in the mood that actually went to would have brought him closer to Gamla, and which if that was indeed a revolutionary headquarters. In terms of what you're saying about the on wheels, it becomes very much a part of Jewish theology. We don't really have a theology, but to the degree that we have theology, the idea is that the Torah is portable. It's a great interpretation there, that yes, the temple is gone, but you take your relationship with God wherever you go. And in the ancient world, in the pagan world, right, when you were exiled from your country and you went to a new country, what do you do in the new country? You adopt the gods of the new country. Right? And remember, when the Judeans go to Babylon in the 580s, they ask Ezekiel, what do we do? What do we do now? And he will give the revolutionary answer that here in Babylon, you can worship God still, pray, do good deeds. Don't bring sacrifice. It's only for Jerusalem, as right from the time of Solomon. But pray and do good deeds. So what happens by the time they come back to Jerusalem, and the temple is reestablished, this alternate means has already been established because of the Babylonian exile, and synagogue life will begin to develop. It's not in place of the temple, but it's parallel to the temple. Torah study, community events, maybe some prayer, and then when the second temple is destroyed, unlike after the first one, this time we have a mechanism in place already, how to continue, and what will Jewish tradition call the synagogue? A mikdash me'at, a small microcosm perhaps of the temple. Just a small one, but to try to see, can we still get this intimacy with God? Personally, I would contend that you look at two groups of Jews, what we call mainstream Judaism, which will say, can we bring this intimacy that we had in the temple with God into the synagogue through Torah study, mitzvot, fulfilling commandments, much more so than perhaps in earlier times. And the Jewish followers of Jesus who said we can go back to a model, like the tabernacle in the desert. God will dwell amongst us. That's how we'll get, if you will, that intimacy. So you might have two different models here of how to do it, kind of idea. So it's all possibly there. But I think you got to look at the text and see what is the text showing us. And today we have archaeology, which can give us a little more information also.
Thank you.
Was this fabulous presentation taped?
It was, and I will get it out as soon as I can. It will probably be next week because I leave on a plane at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. So I'm traveling tomorrow.
No, as long as we get it, I'd like to share it with some friends. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I'll send out the link and we'll put it up on the website. And I just want to thank everybody for coming. Passover is coming. So if anybody wants to, one of the projects that we do is to help families in need during the upcoming Passover holiday. And we give out food vouchers. We used to do food boxes, but because of COVID, they now get food vouchers where they can go and buy groceries. And we also have special needs kids there's a week where they don't have any school, but parents are still working. And so there's a special program that takes care of them and also just gets them out, gives them some experiences that they wouldn't normally get to have. So it's a really fun week that the kids always look forward to every year, especially now with COVID and everybody's been locked down. I think they've made some exceptions for them and they have some different things going on. But those are two of the projects that we've got coming up. If you want to get involved and make a difference in Israel.
What are they having for tours in the fall?
I'll let you answer that, Danny.
Well, I would say we're prayerfully hopeful or prayerfully optimistic. We don't know. But there is a CFOIC tour, I believe, in the fall. It's
canceled. Australia's shut down. So it's officially canceled.
So chances are, that mostly we're going to be looking at, early 2022, I think, before we start to see, groups again. And, we're seeing small signs. We don't know yet when Israel will reopen to we haven't even reopened to Israelis at this point. The airport is shut, but it's beginning to reopen. Speculation is that by summertime, maybe late spring, summertime, Israel will allow in people who are vaccinated or can show enough of COVID testing, not 100% clear, probably at this point only vaccinated. And it'll depend what happens with this pandemic worldwide. If it abates on its own, if it abates because of vaccines or whatever. So we don't know, no one knows what's coming down the line at this point. None of us mortals at least know what's coming down the line. But we're again, I'd say prayerfully optimistic that over the next few months, because we've been closed down for a year, essentially, the tourist industry. Yeah. It's not been easy. And we're hoping, to be reopened as soon as possible.
Thank you.
All right. So everybody stay safe. And
yes.
I'm looking forward to, see you again on Zoom in a month and seeing you here in Israel. That'll be the best.
Amen to that. Tony, in answer to your question, yes, the temple was destroyed after Jesus was crucified. So approximately 50 years, give or take.
Yeah, about 40 years. If we take about 30 and the temple was destroyed about 70. So about 40 years.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Mitsuyan, meule.
Thank you. Thank you for all your great questions.
So
Thank
good.
you, Benny. Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
Blessings. Shalom.
Blessings. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation.
Lila Tov from Israel. Lila Tov from Israel. Good night from Israel.
I hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.